Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we've got another ship comparison video for you. This time, the unbuilt, so-called Tillman type maximum battleship design versus Battleship New Jersey. This video was suggested by one of our fans, and any suggestions you make, we take seriously. Even if you don't literally say, I'm suggesting you make a video, you ask a question in the comment section we think we can answer with a video. We tend to add it to our list. We're making 5 videos a week. We need ideas for content. If you want to see your content idea bumped up, shoot us an email, make a donation to the museum and let us know that you are donating to the channel and want to see a particular video. And that'll bump it up the list. Otherwise, it might be months before we get down the list to the particular video suggestion. And again, we shoot these comparison videos comparing them to Battleship New Jersey, particularly because that's the ship we have, because we have an Iowa-class battleship that you can come on board and see the size of and what the spaces are like and the guns and everything else. It makes sense to us to talk about other ships in the context of this. Tillman-class battleships were never built. They never existed. You cannot go on board one, but you can read their stats. This is how long they were. This is what kind of guns they had. And you can come on board Battleship New Jersey and see how that compares. The Tillman, or the so-called Tillman class of battleships, was a design series created right around when the United States entered World War I. So this is right smack dab in the middle of the dreadnought arms building race. Every year, the United States Navy asked for a new class of 2 battleships. And every year they asked for that class to be a little bit larger. In the United States, Congress gets to dictate how much money and how big new ships are. The Navy has to design their new ships based around what Congress tells them they have the money for. The Navy can make a design and recommend to Congress, hey, let's build this thing, but more often than not, Congress would authorize, all right, for your next year's battleship, it could be 1,000 tons heavier than last year's battleship. And so you see the so-called standard type American battleships, where each class is only incrementally better than the previous class, but they're all using virtually the same guns and fire control systems and whatnot. So they're relatively interchangeable, even though each year gets better. So the U.S. Navy had a very coherent battle line during the interwar period. However, it was blatantly clear to some people that ships were getting larger and larger and larger. And every year the Navy came back to Congress asking for a bigger ship, ships that would obsolete the previous year's battleships. And battleships are very expensive. So Congress didn't like continuously spending taxpayer money on these larger and larger vessels that were then being obsoleted relatively soon. So Senator Pitchfork Benjamin Tillman, who was the chair of the Senate Committee on Naval Affairs, requested on a couple of different occasions that the Navy design a maximum possible battleship. And the Navy didn't much care for this idea. While they wanted to keep building bigger and bigger ships that were better than what other nations had, they didn't actually want to build a maximum sized battleship that would then obsolete the entire fleet and potentially start a new dreadnought arms race. However, after the second or third request, because Tillman controlled the Navy's purse strings to a certain extent, the Navy set about creating some designs. And these designs do really push what industry could do at that time and what designers could create at that time. And so they did have some interesting innovations and features that were beyond what the standard type battleships had. And some of the lessons learned from this design plan, even though the Navy didn't necessarily want to go forward with it, were used in some of the later classes of American ships. So the biggest limit, really the only limit to the Tillman class battleships was the size of the Panama Canal. The locks were roughly 110 feet wide and 1,000 feet long. So any ship you built had to be smaller than that. So all of the Tillman class battleships used basically the same hull, and it was going to be 975 feet long. Remember, New Jersey is 887 feet, so this would be almost 100 feet longer. Pretty close in size to a modern supercarrier, aircraft carrier. So it would have been a very big ship. New Jersey is the longest battleship ever built, and this would have been longer by some 90-odd feet. They would have been 108 feet wide, which is the same width as an Iowa-class battleship, and they would have had a draft of 32 feet, which is actually shallower than Iowa-class battleships. If you look at an Iowa-class battleship from above, it's very narrow forward in order to achieve a high speed. The Tillman-class battleships had a much fuller hull form designed because they had a ridiculous length-to-beam ratio. And typically, a high length-to-beam ratio, like the Iowa class has, equates to a high speed. But it also means that your ship is going to roll a lot more and be a less capable gunnery platform. It's less stable. So the Tillmans have very full hulls, that they have very flat sides down most of their length before they get pointy at the ends. Very much like a canoe, in my opinion. And this would have given them a lot more internal volume and buoyancy, and so that would have made them more stable as gunnery platforms, although I suspect their length-to-beam ratio would have still had some issues. But because they were so full and so buoyant, they would have rode 6 feet higher in the water. While this hull could fit through the Panama Canal, it would have required a massive rebuilding of slipways to build these ships, dry docks to maintain these ships, and piers to dock them at. So not only would it have obsoleted the entire battleship fleet that you had, it would have also obsoleted the bulk of your industry and support system for those ships and required you to start from the ground floor. So that's, among other things, why the Navy wasn't too thrilled by this idea. In 1916, the U.S. Navy created 4 designs for Senator Tillman, and then they chose the 4th design to be further refined into 2 more designs. So these are known by historians today as Tillman 1, Tillman 2, Tillman 3, Tillman 4, and then Tillman 4-1 and 4-2. The second series of designs was produced in early 1917. And like I already said, none of these designs ended up going through with completion. They were never authorized by Congress. The Navy never endorsed them. They never requested them. And none were ever built. I don't think there was ever the chance to build any, whereas some fantasy ships had a very good chance of being built. Many of them were already under construction by the time they were canceled for various reasons. And I think, hey, if you want to add this into your alternate history or your war game or whatever the case may be, it makes sense. I don't feel that way about the Tillman class battleships. It was purely a design study to see what was possible and not actually, here's a design study, let us now build this design. So, let's see. The designs, besides having a really great length, weren't impossible in terms of weight. The early designs, Tillman 1 and 2, were about 63,000 tons. And Tillman 3 was only 57,000 tons. But Tillman 4 was over 72,000 tons. So we're right in the Iowa to Yamato range right there. Iowa was designed at about 45,000 tons, ended up being about 58,000 tons fully loaded. So the smallest of the Tillmans is still around the size of an Iowa. The 63 to 72,000 ton range is more where Yamato sits in the standard to fully loaded range. And I believe these are standard displacement. So fully loaded, you'd probably add another 10,000 tons onto that. Obviously, the Yamatos were possible. The United States designed the Montanas, which were super battleships fairly similar to the Tillmans, although much more modern, but similar in displacement and firepower and whatnot. You know, theoretically, you could produce such a ship. You could not produce such a ship in numbers. Such a ship would be able to win an engagement with any one enemy battleship and fight pretty fairly with multiple enemy battleships. That was the whole design behind Yamato, which was the only super battleship type design that was completed, although different countries had them. Germany with their H-class and the United States with the Montanas. So the whole concept of a super battleship is not crazy. The Japanese authorized super battleship designs armed with 18-inch guns after World War I that would have been smaller than this, but in the same ballpark. And they believed that they could build those ships in the 1920s. And the United States designed fairly similar sized ships during that time period. In fact, some of the characteristics from these vessels will get transferred into the South Dakota class battleships that were designed during World War I and canceled by the Washington Naval Treaty. And those were all under construction. So arguably, these aren't outside of the realm of the possible. The first Tillman design was relatively conventional. Despite its great size, it was going to be 26.5 knots, fast for a standard type battleship at 21 knots, but slow for battle cruisers that were creeping up on 30 knots at that point. It would have had 12 16-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, which is pretty reasonable. And it would have had a belt up to 18 inches thick, which is pretty thick. That's about as thick of armor as we were making in this country at that time. And the belts of the standard class battleships got up to be about 13.5 inches thick. It took a lot of armor like that to arm a ship. So when you're talking about armoring a 975-foot length, and realistically you're only armoring about 2/3 of that length, but still 600 feet with 18 inches of armor plate, that is pretty excessive. The Tillman II design, 26.5 knots, doubled the number of 16-inch guns up to 24 barrels in 4 6-barreled turrets. That's pretty absurd. And to achieve this on the same displacement as Tillman I, it reduced the armor to 13 inches, which is more in line with standard type battleships. So you would have had a ship with really insufficient armor given the size of its guns, 16-inch 50 caliber, but utterly insane broadside. The current class of battleships under design at that time, the Colorado class, only had 8 16-inch guns. So you're tripling that firepower. Twin turrets were preferred by most countries, particularly during this time period. The twin turret gave you enough room to load both guns pretty comfortably and didn't make too large of a barbette, which is a big round hole in the center of your ship that causes some structural issues because your whole weight of turret has to sit in that hole where you can't have any structural features. Triple turrets were in use, and the United States liked them, and some other countries were using them, but by and large, a lot of countries looked derisively at triple turrets because the center gun didn't have as much room to be loaded as the outboard 2 guns. It was crammed in between them. It creates a bigger barbette, like we said, although it's not unworkable. There were a number of successful battleship classes built with triple turrets. And in theory, with a triple turret, you can still have each gun operating on its own slide, although I'm not sure if these would have been like contemporary ships that had all their guns on a single slide, like other standard type battleships, or if they would have had each gun on its own individual slide like an Iowa-class battleship. But when you get up to a 6-gun turret, that's pretty unrealistic. Now you're basically tripling the width of a twin-sized barbette. And remember, these ships can't grow to maximum width. They're still limited to the same 108 feet as an Iowa-class battleship. There's going to be some structural issues there. And you can't put 6 individual barrels on individual slides. I suspect it would have basically been 2 triple turrets slapped together on 2 separate 3-gun slides. So a single hit to a turret is knocking out 6 guns. Even if it's a glancing blow, it might only knock out 3 of your guns. And I honestly don't know if this design is technically feasible. 6-gun turret, never done with large guns like that. The Tillman 3 design, which was the lightest of them, was going to attain a speed of 30 knots, which with that length to beam ratio should be possible. It was going to have 12 16-inch guns again in 4 triple turrets, which again, completely possible. The Montanas do this. The Montanas had basically these stats on a heavier displacement. The South Dakota class battleships had 12 16-inch 50 caliber guns designed into them. So that's not impossible. It would have had, again, a 13-inch armored belt. So Tillman 3, I think, is my favorite in that it is the most possible. And that's the one that probably most closely resembles the South Dakota class battleships. They basically reduce the speed to 24 knots, and therefore they can reduce the length significantly to somewhere around 700 feet, and then build it with existing industry, and it doesn't completely obsolete everything, although it is an order of magnitude larger than any of the other standard type battleships. It's not quite as obsoleting as this. So Tillman 3 is my favorite. Tillman 4 was the one that the Navy chose to continue developing. That was the largest of the designs at 80,000 tons. It would have only had a speed of 25.2 knots calculated out. So that's the slowest of these by far, but again, still 4 knots faster than any of the standard type battleships. It again had 24 16-inch guns. It again used the sextuple turrets. And it had up to 19 inches of armor. So it had enough armor to protect against its own size guns at pretty much any battle range you could expect to engage at. So if you wanted an ultimate design, Tillman 4 was it. And so that design was produced in December 29th of 1916. And by the end of January 1917, they had refined that into the Tillman 4 1 and 2 designs. Both of those were 80,000 tons. Both of them kept the 25.2 knot speed, but they reduced the number of guns and the number of armor plate. These designs expanded to an 18-inch 50 caliber gun. So the same displacement, the same speed. They have a slightly thinner armored belt at 16 inches as opposed to the absolutely absurd 19 inches of their forebearer design, which is still going to be enough to protect you against most things. They dropped down to 13 barrels for the number 1 design and 15 barrels for the number 2 design with 18-inch 50 caliber guns. So the 16-inch 50 caliber gun was in existence at this time, and it would be adopted by the Navy for the South Dakota class battleships, the Lexington class battle cruisers, and then the Iowas and Montanas later on. So that's not too absurd. The Navy did test an 18-inch 48 caliber gun, but it never made it beyond the test phases, and the Navy never liked it better than the 16-inch gun. However, we're designing a maximum battleship here, and you're trying to stay ahead of what foreign countries are doing, and foreign countries were looking at 18-inch guns. The British had put 18-inch guns on some ships. The Japanese were looking at 18-inch guns for ships, and they would, 20 years later, put them on ships. Other countries were looking at similar size designs, or at least designs bigger than the 16-inch guns that the U.S. Navy was using. So it's not crazy to do this. The number 1 design used 5 twin and 1 triple turret to achieve 13 18-inch guns. And this makes more sense. You're not putting big holes in the side of your ship or in the top of your ship that makes them structurally unsound. However, during World War I, we found out that ships that are turret farms tended to explode a lot. The thought going into World War I was you put turrets all over the ship so that a single hit can't knock out multiple turrets. Well, I don't know of a single hit that knocked out multiple turrets, but I do know of a bunch of hits striking turrets or their barbets, punching through and blowing up the entire ship. And during World War I, particularly with British battle cruisers, it was found that when you've got turrets all over the ship and they take a single hit to that turret, it blows up the whole ship. Whereas the ships that had the more traditional or the more modern super firing turrets fore and aft do not get hit in that way. So having a turret farm with 6 turrets spread out over the length of your ship, I think creates an explosion problem. Now you're probably saying, wait, Ryan, these are much better armored than battle cruisers. They probably aren't going to blow up as easily. That's true. The turrets and the barbets are significantly heavier armored. But the size of guns and the armor-piercing capability of guns is increasing. So, I don't know. I don't know if I like that idea. The design 2 was going to have 15 barrels with 5 triple turrets. So that's still pretty excessive, but 5 turrets, not uncommon in the U.S. Navy during the Dreadnought era. The battleship Texas, of course, has 5. And triple turrets for 15, 18-inch guns is not a impossible thing. I do, for some reason, don't ask me why this is, I couldn't tell you, prefer a standardized turret arrangement. They're all twin or they're all triple, opposed to ships that have mixes, like the King George V's with the 4 and then the 2 superimposed. Like, I know why that was, but it makes my stomach turn. I don't know why. The Nevadas, the early designs for the Lexington-class battle cruisers, in particular, Pensacola-class cruisers, and the 1916 design for the Lexington, where it was a triple turret superimposed over a twin. Get out of here. I don't want any of that. None of that. So I do sort of lean towards the 5 triple turrets, and it makes sense. With the twin turrets, you have 2 fewer barrels because you've got to pay for all of these the extra gun turret in weight. But by reducing a gun turret and going to triple size, you can have 2 more barrels in your design. And really, if you're building an 80,000-ton ship, it best have a lot of gun barrels on it. Otherwise, what are you getting for that massive national investment? We've talked about this in the past. Building a few large ships is way worse than building a bunch of smaller ships. So having a fleet of standard type battleships probably did the U.S. better than having 1 or 2 Tillman class battleships that completely obsoleted those. We would have seen the age of the battleship end much earlier if there were only a few super battleships out there, as opposed to decent fleets making it into World War II. That said, if you want me to comment on my favorite World War I-ish era super battleship design, a couple of years later, as part of the design process for the South Dakotas and the Lexington, the U.S. Navy looked at some designs creatively called C and D that were basically 12 16-inch armed ships with relatively high speed and armor protection. And the Navy looked at this, why not build fast battleships in place of building battleships and battle cruisers simultaneously? The concept was starting to come together. HMS Hood, although called a battle cruiser, I consider to be the first fast battleship. And a number of other designs that ended up being canceled from around that time period really fit into the same slot. And I think that is a good compromise. It is better than any battleship that's out there now, but it's not so massively huge that it obsoletes everything. That said, they were large enough that they never existed in large quantities. Hood was probably the only British one, of Vanguard 2. The United States had the Iowa class. The Japanese had Yamato and Musashi. And you could call Bismarck and Tirpitz, because of their gigantism, super battleships in the same way, although they don't get nearly as much for all of their size. Really, any of your battleships that fall in the 40,000 ton range and below are pretty much in line with the upward curve of ships expanding over time. Capital ships have to balance speed, firepower, and armor. And your traditional battleship or battlecruiser can only have two of these things. Super battleships break that curve because they get all three of them. So Hood had 15-inch guns, which was the contemporary size gun. She had armor against it on a scale similar to contemporary sized battleships, and she had a 32-knot speed. The Iowa-class battleships have 16-inch guns. They had armor designed to counter 16-inch shell fire and a 33-knot speed. The Yamato-class battleships had 27-knot speed, 18-inch guns, and armor like that. So your super battleships have everything. Bismarck and Tirpitz have 15-inch guns, heavy armor, and a 30 or 31-knot speed. So you get all three categories. But to do that, you have to pay a lot. So HMS Hood is 10,000 tons more than the class of battleship that comes before her. She gets an extra couple of knots of speed, but she's got the same number of guns and the same type of armor. So is it worth it? The Iowas are 10,000 tons more than a South Dakota, but they've got the same armor, virtually the same guns, and they're just buying 5 or 6 knots of speed. Is it worth it? And it means that you can't build a fleet of these ships. You only have a few of them, which is a problem. You've got to be able to project power all across the world as a world power. And really, world powers are the only ones that are operating battleships. Other countries build and have battleships that they use as coastal defense ships, but they aren't really operating them. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Turkey, but they aren't operating them around the world, projecting power with them, which is what a battleship does. So I tend to think that the Tillman designs are pretty useless, and the U.S. Navy was better served not building them. But let's compare them to an Iowa real fast. Scratch that. We've talked about their size, how it compares to an Iowa. Let's talk about their gunnery. All of these ships would have carried more guns than an Iowa-class battleship. They better for all that displacement. They would have all been slower than an Iowa-class battleship. But they would have all had better armor, except potentially Tillman 2 and 3. They've got thicker armor belts, but it wasn't the same layered system that the Iowas had. So I would give the Iowas the economy advantage. They're much cheaper and use much less resources. I'd give them the speed advantage for sure. These don't even come close. But the Tillmans have the armor advantage and the firepower advantage. And again, it doesn't even come close. When you talk about anti-aircraft guns, these ships aren't specifically designed with them. They've got a bunch of casemate guns, a la other standard type battleships. In fact, some of the casemate positions really revert to older style dreadnoughts and probably wouldn't have been built that way. However, had these ships been built, they would have no doubt been modernized, and by World War II would have had extremely substantial anti-aircraft batteries. I won't speculate on what those would have been, but there's no reason to suspect that they wouldn't have carried more 5-inch 38s, 40 millimeters, and 20 millimeters than an Iowa. So I would give them the anti-aircraft advantage over the Iowas, assuming that they get modernized. As built, it's no contest. Aircraft aren't even a threat to these ships, so they don't bother putting significant AA guns on them. But if you've sat through the last, 30 minutes of this video, you probably know that I would still give the edge to the Iowas, because the Iowas can be built, and in some numbers. The Tillmans are a ridiculous waste of resources for a ship that can only be in one place at one time. And if it's damaged, it takes just as long to repair as a damaged Iowa. I don't think it's all that much more survivable. And there are a very small number of dry docks that can take an Iowa-class battleship. Even fewer that could take these. You'd have to put in a massive infrastructure package just to get dry docks and piers and slipways that can build a Tillman. That's not a deal breaker. The Navy had to do the same thing for the Iowas. They couldn't be built on the existing slipways, and modifications to dry docks had to be made to have them dry docked in certain areas. So not a deal breaker, but they had to spend it for the Iowa. They would have had to spend it even more for something significantly larger. I mean, functionally, we did that because the supercarriers are all in this size range. A modern Nimitz-class supercarrier displaces around 100,000 tons fully loaded, which would have been around the same ballpark. These are 72,000 tons standard, that they'd be close to 80 or 90 fully loaded, which puts them in the range of the conventional supercarriers, which have limited facilities that can build them and dry dock them. And I think these would have been used in a similar way. You would have had a battle group built around one of these vessels deployed to a hotspot. You couldn't build a battle line of these ships, which was the strategy of the day, which was probably why these ships were not built at the time. So, which of the Tillman designs is your favorite? Or which of the unbuilt U.S. Navy designs from this time period are your favorites? There's a link in the description to the U.S. Navy Spring Style Book 1, which is where all of the blueprints for these Tillmans and some other types of battleships and battle cruisers are also stored. I'm a huge fan of Lexington-class battle cruisers. Undeservedly, they're just gorgeous ships. And I'm a huge fan of Design D of the fast battleship design process that was part of the Lexington, South Dakota series. Those ships were all significantly smaller than these Tillmans, but significantly more combat power than the ships that were actually built at that time. So what's your favorite? Let us know in the comments section. Do you think I'm being too harsh on the Tillmans? Do you think they actually had a chance of being built? Tell me I'm wrong in the comments. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of businesses and viewers like yourselves. In particular, the support private individuals like you have given us has allowed us to increase the number of videos we make and the quality of those videos. We really appreciate the support you've given us over the last year and a half. If you'd like to continue to support us, there's a link in the description below. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people hear about us. And that'll help you because then you'll see when we're putting out 5 videos a week. Thanks for watching.